that our survival of the species is what's most important to our bodies and our brains. When we experience any kind of threat, then our first priority is to keep ourselves alive. And most of us, the kinds of threats that we experience as adults aren't always survival related. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes it's more emotional and social and more abuse than physical life threatening. But our bodies react and our brains react in ways that aren't always all that functional. So going into developmental trauma is one way to understand what's happening. So with trauma, it always impairs the functioning in our brain. And when it's childhood trauma or developmental trauma that happens during childhood, it affects the brain because the brain is being developed at that time. And a baby is kind of a clean slate. There's not a lot of activity going on in the brain. Babies don't really come packaged with a fully functioning brain. And they used to think that, the brain was kind of fully developed sometime in teen years, but now they're saying actually it's more like 23 to 25. There's still brain development going on. So our prefrontal cortex, the part around our forehead, behind the forehead, is the executive functioning in the brain, and that takes a little bit longer to develop, which is partly why teenagers don't always make very good decisions. But the interesting part about developmental trauma that we need to think about is that whatever trauma is going on during our childhood, there's a negative effect on the brain, and there's also an effect of some things just don't develop properly. We need a certain amount of social trust in order for the neural pathways that deal with social trust to develop. And if we don't have those, then our actual brain tissue doesn't develop the same way as it would have if we'd had those trust and close relationships in our childhood. So it has a huge impact on our brain, not just the fight, flight, freeze that happens when our life feels threatened, but then there's also this more nuanced development around socializing with each other that doesn't develop properly. One of the things that Dr. Gabor Mate has talked about, he's a Canadian medical doctor who's worked a lot with addiction, is that everybody basically who has addiction has trauma as well. And that when we're babies, what we really need in order to survive not being able to feed ourselves, and we really need some safe, consistent caregiving in order to develop, in order to live. And then as we go on, then we need more social contact, more kind of parenting, which often doesn't really happen so well for a lot of us. So the trauma, not only do we have to find a way to survive it, and we develop all of these strategies around surviving, but it also, we end up with a nervous system that makes it more difficult to do that, because the trauma itself disrupts the connection between the brain and the body. We have hypervigilance, which I think we're probably all familiar with, and it just creates this atmosphere of we're not exactly reading social cues the way that someone who has more trust and more safety in their social relationships would. And then the other big thing that I didn't realize until I started really researching it a few years ago was that people with developmental trauma are more likely to develop PTSD when we're traumatized later in life as well. Sometimes it's kind of hard to recognize that there's many people who aren't traumatized in childhood, because I think we tend to, especially in this kind of work, most of us have had pretty significant developmental trauma. A lot of people, when they're traumatized later in life, actually don't go on to develop PTSD. There's something called post-traumatic growth that can happen. So someone gets in a situation where, they're threatened, or there's something, really significant that's going on, and it's really difficult for a while, but then they come out of it stronger. And that's not always the case with people who have developmental trauma, because our brains don't function quite the same way. And we also often have these core deficiency stories, which we'll talk about a bit later. But I think everyone's familiar with those core beliefs that we have, that we're not safe and that we're not lovable, and those kinds of things that tend to develop based on what's happening in our childhood. The child's brain actually only develops what's needed. So if if the child is in a musical family and they're learning piano, then it's going to develop the neural pathways to play the piano. If it's born into a family of sports nuts or something like that, then they'll develop different kind of body coordination, and it'll develop the neural pathways for that. So that's one of the reasons why enrichment experiences are so helpful for children, because their brain is really being shaped by the demands that are put on the brain. And as we need more brain activity in order to do something, then we just develop that. And that's actually something that happens through our whole lives. The research didn't find out until probably about 10 or 15 years ago that brains are neuroplastic. So actually even our brains keep developing based on what we're asking them to do. And they used to think that once your brain was mature at around 15 or whatever, that was it. You never develop new pathways, but in fact that's not true. So children have this survival imperative for the safe, consistent caretaker. And there's a lot of different ways that can go wrong. I mean, it's what we think of as abuse. There's all different kinds of situations where children are harmed and traumatized very directly. Physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, even ritual abuse, which is a more extreme case, but there are some. And we didn't used to really think that this kind of abuse was all that common, but it's starting to become, people are starting to be more open about it. And the ACEs study, which we'll get to in a minute also, found that there's a much higher incidence of this kind of thing than what anybody ever thought was happening. And one of the interesting things for me was that chronic neglect, not feeling that we matter, has an equal negative developmental impact compared to a child who is abused. So we might not have the same, with neglect, we might not see the same strategies around survival because it works a little bit differently. But pretty much every child who's abused would also have that feeling of neglect and not being seen, not feeling we matter. But then there is also an equal developmental impact of just not feeling like we matter to anybody, that social trust is so important to us that it's really damaging when we don't feel that. And there's some nuances too there. Sometimes children will feel like it matters to their parents if they get good marks and they behave, and that they don't embarrass the family, but that they don't matter. So that's one of the ways that can kind of play out as well. The ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, was developed by an insurance company, Kaiser Medical in the States, and there's been several places that have done this again and found very similar results. So they have these 10 questions. You get 1 point if it's a yes for you. And the higher your points are, then they've correlated it with depression, sexual violence, addiction, all kinds of different things. So this is one of the ways that we can take a look at some of these questions and kind of figure out what our score might be. So let's just take a moment to look at these 5, and then we'll go to the next slide and just answer for yourself or maybe for a child if that's what you're thinking about, what your score might be. We'll go on to the next. Places, if you just look up ACEs questionnaire, you'll find a whole bunch of places that have these questions as well. one of the things that it relates so much to here is that if you have 4 or more points on the ACEs scale, it dramatically increases your chance of being an alcoholic or drug addict in adulthood. It's really significant to go from just over 2% to 16%. And it's an indication, I think, of how holistic this whole process is, that we get, something will happen and we feel threatened, and then we need to find ways to manage our fear, because basically we're in this state of not being sure that we're going to survive. And then there's a natural movement there, and it happens with all of us, that when we feel something like that, we don't want to feel it, so then we look for ways to feel better. And oftentimes, when we're younger, it might be something like food, or people have different ways of coping. Some of the other statistics on this, and we could share Kay's presentation on ACEs so that you can see the rest of the slides from it. It's not just alcoholism. There's, like depression, and even the likelihood that that someone will be raped goes dramatically up depending on your score. There's a really pervasive link between childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, and our experiences later in life. So the core beliefs and deficiency stories are something that people are familiar with in Scott Kiloby's work, that we basically can't risk blaming our parents. And that's how we develop these deficiency stories. So if a child is in a situation where they're not safe for whatever reason, or where they feel neglected, they don't feel seen, then we'll turn that on ourselves and blame ourselves and feel like we're not worthy or we're not lovable. And most of us have strategies. I see a lot of different kind of forms of fight, flight, or freeze, which is our survival mechanism. So, for a child, it could be behaving really, really well in hopes that we'll be kind of under the radar, and whoever it is that's being abusive won't notice us. Or, oftentimes people will feel like if they could just, do something perfectly, or do it in a different way, that, their mom will be happy, or that she'll be, she'll feel better. Lots of times people will feel responsible for their parents' mental health, and feel like if they could have just done it better, if they could just figure something out to help, that their parents would feel better. Or, when we have people in a family, some will go into fight and some will go into freeze. And so sometimes people will be lashing out, and kind of like a lightning rod will kind of draw the anger of a parent, and sometimes draw the violence. There's very complicated relationships with siblings, who sometimes siblings will abuse other siblings, sometimes they will protect other siblings. And it's not an all or nothing kind of a situation. Usually there's a lot of different dynamics going on. And a lot of the work that Kay does with us is talking about these dysfunctional relationships, and how we overcompensate, and how there's all of these patterns of triangulation and that kind of thing going on. And this is where a lot of that starts, is that we're in these situations that are completely overwhelming, and we don't know what to do, and we often don't have adequate parenting to help us figure out what to do. Sometimes what's going on in a child's life too isn't even so much the family of origin. Sometimes it could be partly that, and really be exacerbated by something that's going on at school. There could be bullying, there could be some kind of abuse by a coach or some other adult. And so it doesn't really matter in a way where it happens, the fact that it happens, and then whether or not the child is believed, and if they're kept safe. All of those things have such a massive impact on it. And now in 2016, it's a little bit easier for us to look at it and go, well, a child should be believed if they come and report something like that, because now we have research that says that children really don't ever lie about this kind of thing. But 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, that wasn't really the understanding in society. So we've really come a long way in terms of understanding it. But most of us who are adults now didn't grow up in that kind of an environment. And a lot of children aren't. Now, it doesn't matter that we understand it. There's still a lot of children that are in environments that are unsafe. So the way core beliefs work, and I think, anyone who's kind of worked with a belief of I'm unlovable or I'm not safe or I'm unworthy or whatever it is that once we have that belief, then we don't see anything that doesn't support that belief. So if we have a belief of nobody likes me, then we tend to ignore the people who do like us, and just really the ones who don't, or if we're made fun of, or if we're left out of something, it really lands hard because it lands on that core belief. So that's another dynamic that we work a lot with in the inquiries, is to look at what is the evidence for our belief, and to see that it is just evidence. It's, in that recording that I did about noticing and acknowledging that we're affected by our lives, that's part of it, is that we need to be kind of clear-eyed about this is how it works. Like Laura said at the beginning, we have a trauma, we respond to trauma in a certain way, and we have pretty predictable ways. When they talk about their survival system of fight, flight, and freeze, they just talk about those three things. They don't talk about these are the 87 ways that people do it. So mostly we fall into line with kind of some fairly predictable ways that have evolved over thousands of years of human development. And that development hasn't really kept pace with our modern culture. So what was, really helpful when we were being threatened by pretty physical, immediate dangers isn't actually all that helpful for our survival in terms of, social relationships and even, even being out and about in the world. A lot of the times our perception of threat, if we've had developmental trauma, isn't as healthy as it could be, and then we misread situations. So we might not read a threat that is a threat, or we might overreact to something that isn't, and we end up feeling isolated and not safe as adults as well. Well, and it's important to be precise with our language. And, one of the things that I realize now is that it's not that I was unlovable, it's that I was unloved. And it's probably not even that I was unloved, it's that I felt unloved because I didn't feel seen. And there's a big difference there. So, one of those is an internal experience of feeling unloved. And the other one is, am I actually unlovable? And if we feel unlovable, then we're not really going to believe it. Because I always just thought, well, if someone's that stupid to believe that I'm lovable, they're an idiot, And it wasn't until I really learned more about myself and was kinder with myself and could really start to know myself and love myself that I was able to accept that I was a good person and that somebody could love me. And so it's a combination of the social connections that we can have and our personal work. And we can't really heal without both. It makes sense when we look at it that way. We can look at it and go, here I was, an innocent child who, had these offerings for the adults and, and a really bad negative result from speaking up and saying, whatever it was that you were saying. And no understanding, of course, no understanding that response was abusive and completely over the top and not your fault. That there's nothing that you could have said that would justify anybody hitting you with a baseball bat, certainly not as a child, and breaking your ribs. That is abuse, and there's nothing about that was your fault. Even if you feel like, even if we can track, okay, I did this and then this resulted, it still doesn't mean in any way that it's your fault. And children don't know that. There's no way that we could know that. So it really does have quite an impact. It gets at what you were just saying too, gets at the underlying anxiety that we talk about. When we don't feel safe, then we're not calm, we're not relaxed. We can't engage well with other people. So then they tend to think we're standoffish or we're an idiot or whatever. And it really got a nod and a laugh on that one. And we really, it just impacts everything. I noticed I came out as a lesbian in 76. And at that time, it was not cool the way it is now, in some circles anyway. But I noticed that in some workplaces that I was in, I was open about it, and other ones later on, I wasn't. I worked for an accounting company that it was just like, yeah, it wasn't a cool place to be out there. But I just really noticed that everything shut down. Like I wasn't sharing about what I was doing. I wasn't sharing about who I was because I was always being so careful about what I said and, you know, doing the pronoun game and all of that stuff. And I was just never sure if somebody was going to fire me for it or, you know, shun me for it or whatever. And it landed harder than it might have been because of my experience as a teenager. But it was just a really clear example to me that we can't develop social trust relationships with someone if we're not sure that we're safe with them. And, you know, that if we've had that experience as a child and teenager, that we're not safe with the people that are around us, that people will hurt us if they're close to us, then of course we're not going to trust them. And we shouldn't, you know. And yet we also have this built-in survival need of social interaction and love and connection and being seen. So we can build ourselves a safer life by having really high walls, but that's not a satisfying life. And we need that connection with people that we can trust to do that. The research says that neglect and not being seen has such a negative impact on us. And I certainly felt that too. I felt like the only thing that mattered, and I was told pretty much in those words too, the only thing that mattered was that I didn't embarrass the family. So I had to get good marks and I had to do well in school. And otherwise I was a shame on the family. And I don't know why. I didn't really recognize that either, but it set me up for some, you know, some things that happened in my teen years because I didn't feel loved and didn't feel seen. And then I got into some dangerous situations during my teen years and social shaming and bullying. And it, you know, looking at that now, especially I have a granddaughter who's 14, and she really feels seen and loved by her parents. And she's got good self-esteem. Like it, I can see the difference in how she operates in the world compared to how I did, because, you know, the adults in her life are connecting with her and they know who she is and they actually care who she is. And so, you know, I don't know exactly the mechanism that it works where when we feel not seen for who we really are. We did an interesting thing on shame a few weeks ago in the natural rest group. And one of the things that they were talking about was that shaming is a social mechanism where people can kind of force other people into line. We can, you know, if we know that the result of something is that we're going to be shamed, then that's a real survival threat. And so I'm wondering if part of what goes on with the neglect or not being seen has to do with that, you know, having to, you know, keep the reputation of the family solid and not, you know, not having anyone know that we're having trouble. It's like what stays in the house, what happens in the house has to stay in the house. You're not allowed to talk about what's going on and stuff. So it's a very complex mechanism. And certainly when there's abuse, it makes it more understandable to see, okay, I can see that would be a really hard thing to experience and to survive. And you know, you can see why you'd be messed up from that and why you wouldn't trust people. I think that's really clear. And yet our emotional lives and our feeling of we need to be valued as a person as well seems to have a big impact too. The inquiries are a method where it becomes safe for us to feel what we're trying to get away from. And we're not stupid to try and get away from this. It feels terrible. It feels unsafe. It feels uncomfortable. It feels, when we're judging ourselves or when we're in these situations where we feel isolated and alone, it makes sense to try and do something to feel better. And if we didn't, we wouldn't even have a survival instinct. So we need to have this instinct. It's just that now, in the position that we're in right now, we've found a way, and we found some people to do it with, to actually go in and heal the trauma. And as we are able to connect with somebody and to work through some of these things and to become more friends with the experience in our own system, then the trauma starts to heal. And, I don't any longer have any fear of anything that goes on in my body. I know that any energy that's there, it's not there to hurt me. It's some kind of trauma that's stored in my body, or some kind of protective mechanism that's coming up. And over time, as we experience that directly, then we start to have the confidence that, in fact, we're not this kind of big mess of sensation and energy and thoughts, and it's all this big kind of scary thing that we can never understand. But we actually realize that we could start to be present with ourselves and to trust ourselves to be present, and to have a more friendly environment where we're not judging ourselves, we're not, kind of throwing ourselves away. And so there really is a way to get through this. And that's through the kind of direct looking that we're doing. And that's kind of counterintuitive, feels like, well, that's why there's so much addiction. And I mean, the stats on regular addiction, like substance abuse, are pretty high. But if you consider everything else that we do to numb ourselves and to get away from our experience, it's pretty much everybody. We talk a lot about down-regulating and the nervous system. And if anyone hasn't seen the 2 presentations that I did on the nervous system, email me, let me know, and I'm happy to send you the links for those. So in an ideal situation, parents know how to self-regulate their own emotions, and then they help their children learn how to do that. We need to be able to feel our feelings and to understand our nervous system, to use our breath to calm down, to self-soothe in ways that are healthy and not addictive. My youngest grandson, one of the things that he's been learning to do is to go and pet his dog when he feels upset. And he also does some kind of proactive self-soothing by taking his dog for a walk every day after school. And so that's something that his parents are teaching him to do because it's good for his nervous system, and then he can do it. It takes, he can take kind of the action that he needs to take. And it's really helpful when parents are calm enough and stable enough to do that for children. And people with developmental trauma just generally don't have adults in their lives that are calm enough and mature enough to be able to do that, because the whole definition of developmental trauma is that somebody's out of control and they don't have the healthy self-soothing skills. They don't really know what to do, and then they feel out of control, and the whole situation gets really painful. And when we're hijacked by feelings, and when we have this hyperactivity, the hypervigilant going on, this gets back to the point around addiction. We will try to resolve that feeling any way that we can. So it's helpful to know that I feel a little bit like just an animal mechanism at times, because so much seems to be just our nervous systems and how we respond to things. But the difference being that we have, our more developed brains as well, and we can be watching and noticing this is what's going on in my nervous system and still be taking action to help ourselves. Breath and relaxation are 2 of the real main ways that we can work with giving our nervous system more resilience. But even before that, we can also look at what's going on. If I'm in a social situation where I don't feel safe, it's not wrong to feel that way. It's just how we feel, and then give ourselves permission to do something to help ourselves feel safer, to leave the situation, or at the very least to understand and have some compassion for ourselves because we feel that way. And then, once we're not making the problem worse by judging ourselves, then often there's enough space opens up that we can, it's more workable. When we have that feeling of things are hopeless, I'm so messed up, I'm never going to be better, then it makes sense that we're going to want to get over that, or we're going to want to get through it, or we're going to want to protect ourselves from feeling that way, because feeling that way feels so terrible. And the main point about addiction, and Dr. Gabor Mate is a doctor who's worked a lot with heroin addiction, and he talks about, don't talk about the addiction, don't talk about the heroin, talk about the pain and the trauma. And when Scott first opened the Kiloby Center, I remember he talked about it. He just said, we're really seeing that the trauma that people have has to be resolved before you can really work on the treatment. And before you can really get too far into real recovery, you need to have a way to help people with their trauma. And that's why, 2 different times I went to the Kiloby Center just to work on recovering and healing from PTSD. And it was very, very helpful to be able to do that. And the living inquiries are a really good way to do that. And then at the center, they also do yoga and TRE, which is trauma release exercises that involves kind of tremoring. And they have a bunch of different methods that they're doing there that help to resolve the trauma. Because once we're healed, then we don't need whatever the addictive process or the addictive substances are. We don't need them the way we used to. And then what I found, sometimes we still have the momentum of the addiction going, but it's more workable at that point, because it's okay, I'd like to have a cookie now, or I'd like to have 10 cookies, but it's not, I need that or I'm going to die. So it's the level of compulsion that starts to come down as we heal our underlying trauma, and as our nervous systems get healthier, and we're making choices around not exacerbating the hypervigilance to actually do things that will help us to calm down, that really makes a difference in the level of compulsion and what it is that we can do about addiction. Again, the effect on the nervous system, some people are hearing more about the polyvagal system, the vagus nerve, and it's pretty interesting to know that 80% of the messages between the brain and the rest of the body come from the gut up to the brain, and that our nervous systems really, it's all one system. The brain, the nervous system, our digestive system, it's all really one system, and that we can really impact that system through breathing and through relaxing. And that magic 6 seconds, the parasympathetic nervous system needs at least a 6-second out breath in order for it to stimulate the vagus nerve, which stimulates the relaxation response. So how you get there, through breathing or singing or chanting or counting or however it is, that we need to be exhaling at least some of the time when we're anxious or upset or afraid, to start to develop a longer out breath, and that will really help us to feel safe. Notice how you're breathing. Notice how long it's taking you to breathe in and how long it takes you to breathe out. And most of us are breathing more quickly than 6 seconds on the inhale and 6 seconds on the exhale. And so if we were to have a longer breath, then we would be able to stimulate that vagus nerve and get the relaxation response going. So let's just do an exercise. We just say a sound. The sound is boo. It could be anything. So as you're inhaling, just take kind of a deeper in-breath. And then as you exhale, say that sound. Boo. I do it for at least 6 seconds. Let's do it several times. So just breathe in normally. And then come back to breathing normally. And breathing is one of those things that it doesn't take that long to start to remember about it. You know, if we do some kind of a breathing practice as a practice, then we're more likely to remember it when we need it. And also our breath just generally gets calmer, and that really helps our nervous system. I have a couple of go-tos that we know will help. Like if we know that we always hold tightness in our jaw, or that our shoulders are up like this, we can start to be mindful of it and relax. But those breathing practices of 6-second exhalations, I mean, you can do that just by singing. Like if you like to sing and you've got a song on you like, turn on some music you like and just sing to it. And anything you can do, it doesn't matter how we get to the 6 seconds out breath. It's very calming for the nervous system. And that box breathing, I've noticed quite a few times I'm running into it. It's pretty simple one too. It's just 4, 4, 4, 4. And then it kind of interrupts your obsessive thinking. It interrupts the fear track, and it can help people go to sleep easier. It has all kinds of good results. There's another practice that maybe we could do just right now too. It's called box breathing, and some of you might have heard about it. So you inhale for 4, and then hold your breath for 4, and then exhale for 4, and then hold your breath for 4. So it's like a box. So let's try that. So you could just kind of sit so you can breathe, and then inhale for 4. 1, 2, and hold for 4. And then exhale for 4. And hold for 4. Inhale 4. Hold. And exhale 4. And hold. One more time. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Hold. And then just breathe naturally. Often, even when we know that laying down for 3 or 4 minutes would help, that we won't do it. Or, you know, we'll be sitting in the evening and we'll be upset and kind of triggered, and you know, we'll turn to Facebook or Netflix or something. Instead of doing this for a few minutes, we could even turn Facebook on and breathe, you know. But we go down this tunnel of, I need to get away from this feeling because it feels so terrible. And then we just go with whatever comes to mind. And then how do we insert enough space in there to make a decision that's actually good for our nervous system? And I've been working with that a lot. And I've talked about it off and on about sleeping. You know, it'll be 10 o'clock at night. I'll be tired. And so, you know, oftentimes I can just put myself to bed, and other times it's like, I got to watch one more episode of this, whatever it is on Netflix. It's like, what? And yet sometimes I'll just catch myself doing that, you know, and the next day I'll be tired. It's like, it's a puzzle why we do that. And I think it relates to that feeling of uncomfortable emotions feel like it's a survival threat. And we need to do anything we can to downregulate that and feel better. And it's counterintuitive to that need to escape uncomfortable feelings. And which is probably why most of us don't turn towards it. And we're never going to turn towards it if we don't feel that we could survive it. And, you know, I have a lot of compassion for people who can't get out of their addictions because there isn't a belief there that they can survive without it. And until that belief is there, even if it's a little bit of one or a bit of a willingness to believe it's possible, then we're not going to be able to do that. Kay has said many times, if one person in the multi-generational family does their work, it affects everybody. So it's really worthwhile work to do, that's for sure. Healing is when we feel safe to feel what we feel. I think that's a really good measure. It's not that we don't feel uncomfortable or something, but we feel safe enough to feel it. If you're in a situation where you feel safe and you are, and it's ready to come forward, then it will. And to never ever give ourselves a hard time or feel like we're not doing the right thing because we're not pushing through something. If it's meant to be seen, it'll come forward when it's ready to do that. And it's absolutely fine to back away from it if it doesn't feel like it's the right time. It's really taking good care of ourselves, to be honest and not to be aggressive with ourselves, you know? Yeah. Because those kinds of things can be re-triggering, and we don't want to do that. I find that most of us need help. We need somebody there with us when we're going through the really hard stuff. And then when we are going through things that aren't quite so charged, we can do that more on our own. But pretty much all of us, I get facilitated. Everybody I know gets facilitated. And when something big comes up, especially, it's a good idea to do that. Yeah. And as we heal our nervous systems through, some of this, and part of what happens here in this group is that we're experiencing social safety. We can be honest and show up real and have people get us. And this is a safe environment to do this. And that experience of being safe with other people is really helpful. And that's something that we all do together. Healing is when we feel safe to feel what we feel.